We're now joined by Eley Baynes from the pensions team, who's going to be discussing reform of public sector pensions. Eley, it's my understanding that the reform of public sector pensions came about as a result of a report made by Lord Hutton. Is that right?
Yes, Lord Hutton certainly had a key role to play. He was tasked as a member of the Independent Public Service Pension Commission with reviewing public service pensions. What I mean by public service pensions is, well, there's over 100 different pension arrangements in the public sector, but the key big four that most people will know are the local government pension scheme, which is a funded scheme, and then three big unfunded schemes: the Teachers' Pension Scheme, the National Health Service Pension Scheme, and the Principal Civil Service Pension Scheme. The findings of the Hutton report were that the pension schemes, as they stand now, are unable to respond flexibly to the demographic changes in the workforce. These schemes are decades old, and as you can imagine, decades ago there were fewer women in the workforce and fewer part-time employees. Also, the increased longevity of members had led to rising costs, and so they were becoming more expensive to maintain in their current form. There was an unfair sharing of these costs between the employer, the employee, and of course the taxpayer. And cost was also an issue for service providers who wanted to enter the arena but found the cost of providing a broadly comparable scheme just too prohibitive, and so it was limiting the number of service providers bidding on public sector contracts. So the overall conclusion of the Hutton report was that structural reform was needed.
So in summary, what were the key changes that the Hutton report proposed?
One of the key changes, and one of the big changes, was the change to accrual rate in public service schemes. So up till now, most public service schemes accrue benefits, members accrue pension benefits on a final salary basis. And the Hutton report proposed that this should change to a care basis, or career average revalued earnings. And this means that by April 2015, most active members in the big public service pension schemes will be accruing benefits on a care basis. Another big change proposed by the Hutton report was to link the normal pension age to state pension age, and this means it will increase as the state pension age increases, and it is hoped that this will also help limit the increasing costs linked to the longevity of members. The report proposed that existing pension promises made to members nearing retirement should be honoured, and so they should see no change in their benefit design. Another change proposed by the Hutton report was to bring in a fixed cost ceiling. This goes back to the point about the taxpayer having to support these unfunded pension schemes, and the fixed cost ceiling would limit the costs that the taxpayer would contribute to pension liabilities, and then in the event that this cost ceiling was reached, this would trigger a consultation, and the consultation would consider ways to manage this liability, for example, by increasing contribution rates from employees or changing the accrual rate.
So we've been hearing about the new fair deal. Can you tell us what that is?
It's not law, it's just guidance. The new fair deal is designed to protect the pensions of public service employees who are outsourced from their central government or NHS employer to a private sector contractor.
And what were its key principles?
The objective of New Fair Deal was to provide value for money, better value for money for taxpayers, and to open up the arena to greater competition and bring in new bidders. Under Old Fair Deal, which was introduced back in 1999, generally employees that were outsourced were put into broadly comparable pension schemes. Under New Fair Deal, the key principle is that these employees will remain in a public service pension scheme, or if they have previously been outsourced out of a pension scheme and put into a broadly comparable scheme, they will then be put back into a public service pension scheme.
And can you tell us when all this comes into force?
New Fair Deal was effective straight away as soon as it was published back in October 2013. And so we can expect to see it implemented in procurement practice as soon as practicable, and in any event by the long stop date of April 2015. Old Fair Deal, of course, does remain in force and will still apply in certain circumstances.
To whom does the new fair deal apply? And perhaps more importantly, is there anybody that it doesn't capture?
It applies to central government departments, it applies to the NHS, it applies to maintained schools, including academies. It doesn't apply to local government best value authorities. As you may know, these are covered by the 2007 direction. And of course, it doesn't actually apply to the service providers. As we said before, it's up to the government bodies, the outsourcing authorities, to impose the contractual obligations on the service providers in their service contracts.
So you said that this is statutory guidance. What contractual documentation is needed to bring this into effect?
Well, of course, there's the contract for services, and this is a contract between the outsourcing authority and the service provider. And then there will also be some form of participation agreement, and this will be between the service provider, the contracting authority, and the public service pension scheme. Under the participation agreement, there may be some requirement for a bond, a guarantee, or an indemnity, and this, of course, will require further legal documentation.
So are there any exceptions to outsourced employees being put back into public sector schemes?
Yes, there are some exceptions. In exceptional circumstances where there are special reasons, it may not be appropriate to put outsourced employees back into a public service scheme. For example, where this may distort competition between bidders. In these circumstances, old fair deal would still apply, and it's likely these employees would be left in a broadly comparable scheme or put into a new broadly comparable scheme. The contracting authority has been asked to rigorously test any such special reasons. So we don't expect to see this relied on much in practice.
Can you tell us what the benefits are for service providers of the new fair deal?
The new fair deal removes some key obstacles that were present under old fair deal. The first of these is the costs of setting up and operating a broadly comparable scheme. This was a deterrent to many providers who didn't want to bid for contracts. Also, it removes some of the risks and uncertainties associated with operating a separate trustee-run pension scheme, particularly in relation to investment performance. And finally, it smooths out the uneven playing field that we used to have between public sector bidders and private sector bidders.
So what does this mean for second and third generation contracts?
When an existing contract where there's already outsourced employees is relet or retendered under new fair deal, the starting position is that the employees will be transferred back into an appropriate public service scheme rather than remaining in the broadly comparable scheme. An appropriate public service scheme generally means the scheme they were in before they were transferred out of the public service. As you can imagine, the public service schemes have changed or may have changed since the contract was first outsourced and the employees left the scheme, and also the broadly comparable scheme may also have changed its benefit design. And so there's likely to be differences between their pension benefits under the broadly comparable scheme and the pension benefits that they'll receive when they're transferred back into the public service scheme. So this is an HR issue that will need to be addressed by service providers.
So is it possible for people to be returned to the public sector schemes mid-contract?
Yes, this is the idea of outsourced employees being returned to a public service scheme midway through the contract term and not waiting for it to be relet. This has generated quite a lot of interest amongst service providers. I've not seen this happen in practice yet, but I am aware that some service providers are in dialogue with outsourcing authorities. It's my understanding that the decisions will be made on a case-by-case basis, and service providers should bear in mind that any cost savings they make by returning their employees midway through a contract may well need to be shared with the outsourcing authority.
So what are the key points we need to know about participation in the public sector schemes?
Even though the employees will change employers, they will continue to accrue pension benefits and their pensionable service will be treated as continuous. Another thing to bear in mind is the contribution rates. Normally there will be a standard contribution rate for employers. However, as you can appreciate, some of the employers joining the scheme will have a weaker covenant, and this means that at a fund valuation later on, it may be that their contribution rates are increased to reflect the risk. In such cases, the employer will have to pay those increased contribution rates, unless, of course, they've managed to negotiate some form of risk-sharing arrangement with the contracting authority right at the beginning of the contract. And in such a scenario, they'll be able to pass through the increased costs to the outsourcing authority.
And are there any other costs that need to be thought about?
Yes, indeed. There's the possibility of an exit payment, even though these are unfunded schemes. Also, an employer's contribution could be increased if they make unusually high pay increases to their staff, or if they exercise their employer discretions in a way that increases pension benefits for their employees. And finally, there's the transitional protections, which we talked about earlier. That means that employees who are within 10 years of retirement will continue to enjoy the same benefits, pension benefits, as they have at the moment, and these will not be changing from final salary to care.
So in summary, what are the key points that in-house lawyers should take away from this session?
There's a number of key points that in-house counsel should take away from this session. One is that the public service pension schemes are moving from final salary to care accrual, and they will all be care accrual by 1st of April 2015. Another is that new fair deal is in, it's here, and you can expect to see that in practice. A key feature of new fair deal is continued access to a public service scheme for employees even after they've been outsourced. However, old fair deal has not quite gone away, it's not disappeared yet. And finally, relets of contracts are complicated and legal advice may be needed.
Eley, thank you so much for explaining such a complicated subject to us so clearly.
Thanks, Mark.